You have seen that thumbnail. You have read those words. He's a scumbag. And if you clicked on this video, you already know there is serious fire behind that statement. Jerry Lawler sat on a podcast and said exactly that. A Jay Styles sat on that same show, looked straight into the camera, and said he had zero respect for the man. Two legends from two completely different eras of professional wrestling, arriving at the exact same conclusion about the exact same person. And they are not alone. Not even close. So the question is not whether people hated Paul Heyman. The question is, why? What does a man have to do to earn this kind of lasting, bone-deep contempt from the legends of the industry he helped build? That is the story we are telling today. Stay with us. Before we get deeper into this, if the story is already landing for you, go ahead and give this video some hype right now. Hit that hype button. It takes 2 seconds, it costs you nothing, and it helps this video reach more wrestling fans who deserve to hear these stories. We appreciate every single one of you for it. Now here is where we have to start honestly. Before we get to the bad stuff, and there is a lot of bad stuff, we have to acknowledge the full picture. Because part of what makes Paul Heyman such a complicated figure is that the same qualities that made him brilliant are the exact qualities that made him destructive. You cannot properly understand the hatred without first understanding the genius that surrounded it. Paul Heyman might be the greatest talker in the history of professional wrestling. Full stop. That is not a claim made lightly. That is something that even the people on this list, the people who despise him most, would quietly admit if you asked them in an honest moment. The man could take a microphone, stand in the center of a ring or a television screen, and make you feel things you were not expecting to feel. He had a rare gift for language and persuasion that the business had never really seen before. But the microphone was only one piece of it. He was also a visionary in the truest sense of the word. He took a small bingo hall in Philadelphia, a promotion with no corporate backing and no mainstream television deal, and he turned it into Extreme Championship Wrestling. He turned it into the most influential wrestling company of the entire 1990s. He did not have the resources that WCW had. He did not have the global machine that WWE was building. What he had was a vision, a roster of performers willing to bleed for that vision, and a marketing brain that could make the whole thing feel like a movement rather than just a wrestling show. And ECW was more than just a wrestling show. It was a cultural moment. It changed the language of the entire industry. The matches were different. The atmosphere was different. The attitude was different. The way the performers connected with the audience was unlike anything else that existed at the time. And Heyman was the architect of all of it. He helped push the industry toward the Attitude Era. He redefined what was possible inside a wrestling ring and on a wrestling stage. He gave opportunities to performers who were overlooked everywhere else and turned them into legends. For every person who became a star because of Paul Heyman, the gratitude is real. That cannot be taken away from him. His creative contributions are permanent and they matter. But here is what else is permanent. He left behind a trail of legends who could not stand him. Men who worked alongside him, bled for his vision, turned down better opportunities out of loyalty to him, and came out the other side feeling robbed, lied to, and discarded like tools that had served their purpose. The word that keeps coming up across decade after decade and story after story is the same word you saw in that thumbnail. Today we are counting down the 10 WWE legends who hated Paul Heyman. We are going from number 10 all the way down to number 1. And we are starting with the most recent and most public explosion first, because it proves that none of this is ancient history. Number 10, AJ Styles. The year was 2020. Paul Heyman was operating at the peak of his corporate influence inside WWE. He held the title of Executive Director of Raw. He had real creative power. He had a direct connection to the top of the company. He had a seat at the table where decisions were made. And he used that seat, that power, and that access to look one of the most respected professional wrestlers alive directly in the face and tell him a lie so cold it ended their professional relationship permanently. Luke Gallows and Carl Anderson were released by WWE in April of 2020. These were not just names on a roster to AJ Styles. They were two of his closest friends in the entire wrestling business. They had traveled the world together. They had built something together. They were the OC. When those releases were announced, Styles did not go to social media first. He went straight to Heyman. He walked into that office and he asked directly whether Heyman had any involvement in the decision to let his friends go. Heyman looked him in the eye and swore he had nothing to do with it. He went even further. He told Styles that if he had known Gallows and Anderson were on the chopping block, he would have gone to bat for them. He made a promise. He made it directly to Styles' face. It was a lie from start to finish. Styles found out the truth from multiple sources, including people who had been present inside the creative meetings where the decision was made. Heyman had not only known about the releases in advance, he had been one of the voices pushing for them. He had specifically pointed to the salaries of Gallows and Anderson as a financial burden on the Raw brand. He had made the case that they should be let go. Then he had sat across from their best friend and told him the exact opposite. When Styles confirmed what had actually happened, the response was not quiet or private. He went on a live stream and called Heyman a bold-faced liar. He said he had zero respect for the man. He said he could not stand to look at him. He was done. The betrayal was so complete and so calculated that Styles did not stop at venting about it. He made a formal request to be transferred to SmackDown specifically to remove himself from Heyman's management. He did not want to be on the same brand. He did not want to be in the same building. He wanted distance. He also offered the public a look at how the broader locker room viewed Heyman during that period. He said it was genuinely difficult to find anyone backstage who actually liked the man. He said Heyman had developed a consistent pattern of using the wrestlers under him as a way of deflecting blame from his own creative failures. When things went wrong, the talent absorbed the criticism. Heyman moved on. Shortly after all of this became public, Heyman was removed from the executive director role. His time at the top of Raw was finished. For AJ Styles, the only regret was that it had not happened sooner. The thing that makes this story cut so deep is not just the dishonesty itself, it is the deliberateness behind it. Heyman did not tell Styles the truth because maintaining Styles' loyalty and cooperation was more strategically useful to him than honesty was. That calculation, using personal relationships as strategic assets rather than respecting them as human connections, is the Paul Heyman fingerprint. You do not look a man in the eye and promise something you know is false by accident. You do it because you believe the lie will hold long enough to no longer matter. And when it does not, the damage is permanent. Styles did not just lose trust in one person. He lost the ability to take anything said inside a WWE creative meeting at face value. And that appears on everything that follows. Number 9, Jerry Lawler. To find where the hatred for Paul Heyman truly starts, you have to leave the modern era behind. You have to travel back to the roots of the business. You have to go to Memphis, Tennessee, and to a time before ECW ever existed. And you have to understand what Jerry Lawler built there and why he has never fully forgiven the man who he believes walked in and took it without acknowledgement. Jerry Lawler is wrestling royalty. He is a man who defined a territory and helped shape an entire style of the business. The Memphis formula was not just a booking approach. It was a specific philosophy about how to tell stories that kept fans emotionally invested week after week. It used serialized drama. It used weapons and real-feeling physicality. It blurred the line between performance and genuine confrontation in a way that made the crowd lean forward every single time. Lawler was at the very center of building that approach. And then along came Paul Heyman, who, in Lawler's view, took that formula, transported it up the East Coast, dressed it in black leather and Philadelphia attitude, called it extreme, and collected credit for inventing something that had already existed for years in the South. Lawler has used the phrase thief of intellectual property when talking about Heyman. He has been consistent about it for decades. He viewed Heyman as someone who lacked the fundamental integrity that the old-school territorial promoters had. Someone who built a reputation on the work of others without ever looking back to give credit where it was honestly owed. Their conflict became very public during the 1997 ECW invasion of WWE Raw. Lawler served as the on-air antagonist to ECW during that entire period. The feud was designed as a worked shoot, meaning it was built to make fans unsure where the performance ended and the real feeling began. But for Lawler, the real feeling was always there underneath. He was not purely acting. It was during this era that Lawler invented the nickname that would trail Heyman everywhere he went for the rest of his career, the Walrus. That name was chosen and deployed specifically to humiliate Heyman, not to build a storyline, to strip away the image of the visionary revolutionary and replace it with something ridiculous. Lawler did not see a genius. He saw an interloper who had not earned his place in the business. The physical dimension of their relationship was not gentle either. Reports from inside the business indicate that Lawler intentionally broke Heyman's jaw during a legitimate physical confrontation in Memphis. That was not a worked spot that got out of hand. Insiders at the time viewed it as a receipt, a physical answer to years of professional disrespect delivered through legitimate force. Lawler's position has remained consistent across the decades. Heyman persuaded an entire generation of wrestling fans that he was a disruptor, a revolutionary, a man who created something entirely new. Lawler says the truth is that he was a copyist who never once acknowledged the Southern wrestlers and promoters who had done the foundational work before him. That lack of acknowledgement was not forgetfulness, it was a choice. In the world of professional wrestling, where reputation and legacy matter deeply, that choice was not a small one, it was an erasure. And Lawler has made sure, across every year since, that the record was never allowed to stay erased. Number 8, Tommy Dreamer. Every name on this list carries some degree of pain, but Tommy Dreamer's story exists in a different category entirely. Because Dreamer was not a skeptic who got fooled once. He was a full believer. He gave everything he had, and the betrayal he experienced as a result of that belief went deeper than almost anything else in this story. Dreamer was so completely invested in ECW and in Paul Heyman that he repeatedly turned down offers from WCW and WWE to remain loyal. He chose devotion over dollars. He chose the brotherhood over his own financial security and his own career advancement. He said no to money because he believed in the mission. He believed Paul Heyman when Heyman told him they were building something that would matter forever. He believed they were family. When ECW shut down in 2001, the truth came out in layers. The company had not simply run out of luck or money. It had been operating inside a sustained financial deception. Heyman had been concealing the true state of the company from his own roster. He had been telling his performers that the ship was stable, while secretly negotiating his own future with WWE and keeping that information entirely away from the locker room that trusted him. Dreamer had put his body through years of physical punishment. He had put his career on hold. He had looked WCW and WWE offers in the face and said no, because he trusted the man he was working for. That trust had been used as a management tool. Devotion kept costs down. Loyalty kept people working without pushing back too hard on missing or reduced paychecks. As long as the believers kept believing, the whole structure held together. When the structure collapsed, it took Dreamer with it. He fell into a depression that he has spoken about with remarkable openness. And during WrestleMania X7 in 2001, that depression reached a point that he has since made public. He has admitted to contemplating a murder-suicide involving Paul Heyman at that event. That is not hyperbole. That is where one of Heyman's most devoted performers ended up as a direct result of years of emotional manipulation and financial deception. Heyman had made Dreamer feel like a warrior in a cause worth dying for. That is a powerful thing to do to another human being. It creates a bond that goes beyond a normal working relationship. And when that bond is built on deception, when the cause turns out to have been the mechanism by which a man controlled and underpaid his labor force, the collapse of that bond does not feel like losing a job. It feels like losing a version of yourself. Dreamer poured his identity into ECW. Paul Heyman knew that and kept building on it every single day. And then when the cause ended, Dreamer discovered that the man who had preached about sacrifice had already made his own quiet arrangements with the other side. Number 7, Sabu. Sabu built an entire career on physical risk. He threw himself through tables, off elevated surfaces, into barbed wire, into structures that would have hospitalized most performers. He was one of the most unique and extreme performers the business had ever produced. His body absorbed a lifetime of punishment in the ring, and when ECW collapsed, he had nothing to show for it. Not just no job, he lost his house. He has stated publicly that Paul Heyman's business practices directly cost him his home. Sabu is not a man who wraps his feelings in careful language. He has called Heyman a scumbag with the same directness he used in the ring. He has talked about months of back pay that was discussed and then never delivered, about bonuses that were agreed upon in conversation and then never materialized, about performing night after night for a boss who owed him money and who kept deferring rather than paying. The argument that Heyman was simply bad with money is not something Sabu has ever accepted. For Sabu, the framing of incompetent rather than deliberate lets Heyman off far too easily. His view is that Heyman knew exactly what he was doing. He created a working environment built on a belief system so powerful that the performers inside it would continue giving their physical best, even when the paychecks were not reflecting what they had been promised. The devotion to the cause substituted for proper compensation. That was not an accident in Sabu's telling. That was a deliberate structure designed to maintain a cheap and devoted labor force. Sabu paid for his devotion with permanent physical damage, with his savings, and with the roof over his head. And the frustration he carries is compounded by the fact that Heyman went on to have a celebrated second and third act in the same business. While Sabu was dealing with the consequences of trusting the wrong person, Heyman was collecting new accolades. For someone who lost what Sabu lost, that contrast does not sit quietly. Number 6. Rob Van Dam. Rob Van Dam was the central figure ECW rallied around in its final years. He was the performer the crowds came specifically to see. He kept the brand feeling relevant while everything around it was coming apart at the seams. He was also owed months of back pay when ECW closed in 2001. Like everyone else, he was left with nothing when the lights went out. But the moment that permanently changed his relationship with Paul Heyman did not happen in an ECW building. It happened on his television screen at home. He turned on Monday Night Raw and saw Paul Heyman at the commentary table. Not as a one-time guest, as a WWE employee with a regular seat. Heyman had taken care of himself. He had a job, an income, and a place in the biggest wrestling organization on earth. He had arranged his own safety net before the collapse and had not told a single person in his locker room that this arrangement existed. The performers who had worked without proper pay because Heyman told them things were going to be fine were still unemployed, still owed money for work already done, still waiting for something that was never coming. RVD has spoken about how that single image reframed everything he thought he knew about their relationship. All the language about brotherhood and revolution and standing together against the corporate machine turned out to mean one thing in practice. Heyman stood together with his roster right up until the moment it was time to survive. Then he made sure he was first through the door. He had been quietly negotiating his own position while performing the role of loyal champion to his locker room until the very end. The respect RVD once had for Heyman did not diminish gradually. It ended completely the moment that television showed him what had actually happened. RVD has noted that part of what made the betrayal so complete was the performance that preceded it. For years, Heyman had spoken about his roster as if they were his family, his people, the heart of his vision. He had used that language to inspire the kind of devotion that allowed him to operate with financial obligations he could not fully meet. And then he quietly took care of himself first. The language of brotherhood had served its purpose. Number 5. Kurt Angle. Kurt Angle nearly walked away from professional wrestling permanently before his career even properly began. The reason for that starts with one ECW event in 1996 and one creative decision that Paul Heyman either made or allowed to happen on his watch. Angle had just returned from the Atlanta Olympics as a gold medalist. His image was clean and heroic. Every major wrestling company wanted to sign him. WWE had a contract offer sitting on a table waiting for his signature. The number attached to it was $500,000 per year for 10 years. That was the kind of financial certainty that changes a person's trajectory entirely. Before signing anything, Angle went to an ECW event. He expected professional wrestling. What he saw instead was a segment in which Raven and his group took a performer called the Sandman, tied him to a wooden cross, and placed a crown made of barbed wire on his head. Angle was a devoutly religious man. What he saw that night struck him as deeply blasphemous. He saw it as a direct and serious threat to the clean, heroic image he had built as an Olympic champion. He went backstage and made his position absolutely clear in a confrontation that left no room for ambiguity. He stated that if he was in any way connected to footage from that event, a lawsuit would follow. The experience shook him so severely that he walked away from the wrestling business for the best part of 2 years. He did not sign the $500,000 per year contract. When he eventually came back and signed with WWE, the starting rate was $52,000 per year. That gap represents the direct financial consequence of one Paul Heyman production decision. One segment on one night that Heyman chose to put in front of the very man who was considering a future in the business. The damage to Angle's relationship with Heyman continued into 2006, when WWE relaunched ECW as a third brand and Angle was placed on the roster. He viewed that placement as a demotion. He felt that Heyman's creative compass consistently prioritized shock and provocation over the dignity of the performers doing the actual work. That experience became one of the reasons Angle cited when he left WWE for TNA in 2006. The original wound from 1996 had never fully healed, and being placed on a brand associated with the man who had caused that wound in an environment that still felt like it prioritized provocation over dignity made the decision to leave considerably easier than it otherwise might have been. Number 4. Edge. Edge was present for what many wrestling fans consider the peak of Heyman's run as a creative authority inside WWE. The SmackDown brand in the early 2000s, during the period known as the SmackDown 6 era, produced some of the best professional wrestling that company had ever put on television. The in-ring quality was exceptional week after week, but Edge has talked about the reality of what that locker room was actually like from the inside. And what he describes is not the creative paradise that the on-screen product suggested. Heyman maintained his creative control through a specific management approach. He would intentionally create friction between performers. He would pit wrestlers against each other by providing different information to different people. He would plant seeds of suspicion and insecurity between colleagues who were supposed to be working as a team. By keeping everyone uncertain about where they stood, uncertain about who they could trust, uncertain about who had Heyman's real confidence, he ensured that everyone came back to him. He was the one stable authority in a room full of doubt. Edge described this as a divide-and-conquer strategy. Keep the performers in a state of ongoing insecurity. Keep them focused on competing with the person working beside them, rather than questioning the person running the show. In that psychological environment, compliance with Heyman's creative direction was the path of least resistance. The product that came out of this approach was genuinely great television, but the environment that produced it was built on manufactured tension, eroded trust between colleagues, and the consistent treatment of professional wrestlers as instruments in a psychological operation rather than as professionals deserving of straightforward management. The fact that Edge still brings up those SmackDown years as an example of toxic management tells you it left a mark. Great television came out of that era, but it came at a cost that was paid by the people in that locker room. Number 3. JBL. JBL is a man defined by his respect for the structure and tradition of the wrestling business. He values the codes of conduct that have kept the industry operating across generations. He values financial stability and professional integrity. And from his perspective, Paul Heyman was a direct and ongoing threat to every one of those values. JBL has described Heyman as a con man on more than one occasion. His view is that Heyman wrapped dangerous business practices and financial recklessness inside the language of revolution and dressed them up as creative courage. JBL was never buying it. He saw clearly that other people were absorbing the costs of choices Heyman was making. The most famous and most public collision between these two men came at ECW One Night Stand in 2005. Heyman stood in the ring at the Hammerstein Ballroom in New York with an ECW crowd behind him and JBL watching from the balcony above. Heyman picked up the microphone and delivered what the wrestling world now regards as the most famous shoot promo in the history of the business. He pointed at JBL and called him a paper champion. He told that entire crowd that JBL had only held the WWE Championship because Triple H had no interest in appearing on Tuesday nights. Every person in the building understood the context, but the real feeling underneath those words was visible on JBL's face. The fury was not manufactured for cameras. The physical confrontation that followed later that night carried an intensity that went beyond the script. The genuine mutual contempt between these two men came through everything that night as clearly as anything either of them had ever said publicly about the other. For JBL, Heyman was not a creative visionary. He was a man who swapped talent for manipulation and replaced professional stability with chaos. The one-night stand promo is still celebrated all these years later as one of the most electric moments in wrestling history. But for JBL, the memory of that night is not about the electricity. It is about standing on that balcony knowing that the man in the ring was operating with real contempt dressed up as performance art. And the business paid a price for that exchange. Number 2, Vince McMahon. No relationship in Paul Heyman's career contains more complexity or more revealing information about who Heyman actually is than the relationship he had with Vince McMahon. McMahon understood Heyman's talent better than almost anyone. He had seen the evidence. He knew what the man was capable of creatively. And across more than 2 decades of professional connection, he still fired him 4 separate times. That fact alone tells you something significant. The cycle was remarkably consistent. Heyman would produce something brilliant. McMahon would respond to the brilliance by bringing him into the fold. They would work together and things would move forward. Then Heyman would find the edge of what was professionally acceptable and step past it. McMahon would reach the end of his tolerance, and the relationship would end until the next beginning. The firing in late 2004 exposed the most about Heyman's character during that period. He was the lead writer for SmackDown, and word emerged that he had been secretly listening to private Raw conference calls. He initially denied it, but he later sat across from Steve Austin on a podcast and admitted that while he had technically fallen asleep during the specific call that triggered the alert because his phone died and the click of disconnection was heard by everyone on the line, he had deliberately and intentionally listened in on 6 other Raw calls in the weeks before. 6 calls, not one mistake. 6 deliberate acts of professional espionage against the competing brand. McMahon treated it accordingly, and the chapter ended immediately. What McMahon experienced repeatedly across their history was a man whose creative gifts were real, but whose relationship with operating inside any structure built by someone else was fundamentally broken. Heyman would always reach the limit of acceptable behavior and cross it every single time. The removal from the Raw executive director role in 2020 was the 4th time this particular story had reached this particular ending. And at a certain point, the pattern itself becomes the story. McMahon kept bringing Heyman back because the talent was real and undeniable. Heyman kept crossing the line because he was constitutionally unable to accept someone else's authority as the final word on anything. That combination produced some incredible wrestling television. It also produced 4 separate firings across 2 decades. Both of those things are true at the same time. Number 1, Big Show. In 2006, WWE launched a 3rd brand built around the letters ECW and asked Paul White, known to the world as The Big Show, to be its champion and centerpiece. He has described everything that followed as a nightmare. Not as a disappointment or a frustration, a nightmare. The core problem was a conflict at the very top that was never resolved. Heyman wanted to bring back the original ECW. He wanted the edge, the unpredictability, and the specific atmosphere that had made the original company matter to its audience. But this was now a WWE production, operating inside corporate boundaries, with different standards and a different audience demographic to consider. What resulted from that unresolved conflict was a product that managed to alienate almost everyone who watched it. The original ECW fanbase saw a watered-down imitation of something they had loved. The broader WWE audience had no clear understanding of what the brand was supposed to represent. The creative direction became so confused and directionless that the programming began featuring things like priests and zombies as regular characters. Elements that had absolutely nothing to do with what ECW had ever stood for or meant to its audience. The performers caught in the middle, including Big Show at the very top of the card, had no stable creative identity to build around because the people responsible for providing that identity were locked in a power struggle that neither side was willing to yield on. The whole structure fell apart at December to Dismember in 2006. That pay-per-view became one of the worst received events in WWE history. The fallout from that night ended Heyman's involvement with the brand. He was sent home. The ECW brand continued operating without him until it was eventually ended permanently. Big Show had been placed in a position of genuine creative importance on a brand that was supposed to matter to fans. He ended up trapped between two competing philosophies of what wrestling should be, with no resolution ever coming, and the performers who showed up every week to do their professional best absorbed all the consequences of the failure at the top. Big Show has been very direct about this period in his career. He did not enjoy being the flag bearer for a brand that had no clear flag. He wanted to be part of something he could be proud of. What he got instead was a front row seat to a power struggle that turned one of wrestling's most storied names into a cautionary tale about what happens when ego outlasts good judgment. Now pull all 10 of these stories back and look at them as a single picture. The same 4 mechanisms appear in every story on this list, every single one. The first is the weaponization of loyalty. In ECW, above all, Heyman did not simply employ wrestlers. He turned them into believers. He made people feel that they were part of something sacred, something worth sacrifice, something bigger than any individual career. And because they believed that, they would endure worse conditions, accept delayed or reduced pay, and ask fewer hard questions about the financial reality of their situation. The devotion was not an accident. It was the control mechanism. When the illusion ended, the depth of the betrayal was directly proportional to the depth of the belief. The second is the manufactured blur between what was performance and what was real. Heyman was a master at incorporating genuine friction and real-world tensions into scripted television. This produced compelling content, but it created a working environment in which nobody could fully trust whether what had just happened was a professional decision or a personal attack. That constant low-level uncertainty accumulates over time into something much heavier and much harder to release. The third is financial strategy dressed as incompetence. The polite version of the ECW story is that Heyman was just bad with money. The Sabu version, the RVD version, is that Heyman deliberately kept his entire roster uninformed about the true financial state of the company and about his own private arrangements with WWE, because an uninformed and believing roster was a roster that kept working and kept costs manageable. He maintained that position until the very last moment and then secured his own exit before the rest of the locker room knew the game was over. The fourth is the collision with modern professional standards. AJ Styles is the proof of what happens when old carny habits meet a performer who grew up in a different version of this business. Styles expected professional honesty. He expected that a direct conversation carried real weight. When Heyman applied the same approach he had always used, the result was public, immediate, and damaging to everyone involved. So what is the final verdict on Paul Heyman? Here is the honest answer that holds everything together at once. He was genuinely brilliant. The impact he had on professional wrestling is real and permanent. The matches, the atmosphere, the creative revolution he helped spark, none of that is fabrication. For every performer who credits him with building their career, that gratitude is legitimate. His talent for promotion and storytelling belongs at the very top of anything the business has ever produced. But for every person who says Heyman made them, there is someone else saying he cost them everything. Their savings, their home, their health, their trust in the people standing beside them, their peace of mind, their ability to believe in the idea that the wrestling business could be honest about what it was. The genius and the damage came from the exact same original source. Heyman saw value in people and leveraged it completely. He saw loyalty and treated it as a resource to exploit rather than a responsibility. He saw creative opportunity and pursued it without fully accounting for what it cost the people around him. That capacity made him one of the most remarkable minds in the history of the business. And it is precisely what made legends from Lawler to Styles, from Dreamer to Sabu, from Angle to Big Show, arrive at the same conclusion after knowing him up close. The wrestling business will always reward big minds, and it always has. But the foundation underneath all of it is trust. And when you spend your entire career testing that foundation, when you treat the trust of the people around you as something that can always absorb one more breach, you should not be surprised when the legends who built their careers in your orbit eventually turn around and tell the world exactly what they think of you. That is the full Paul Heyman story, the genius, and the price of it. Now it is your turn. Out of every legend on this list, who do you think had the most legitimate reason to hate Paul Heyman? Drop your answer in the comments right now. And while you are down there, hit that like button. Subscribe if you are not already part of this channel. And stay close because we have got more stories exactly like this one coming your way very soon.